All right. So we've been doing a couple months now of going through the story of the Bible. If you've been here, Grant has been preaching on pretty much from Genesis all the way up through, I think last week was probably Daniel. And we've been going through the history of God and his people in the Bible through the narrative stories. So this book called The Story kind of takes out the non-story aspects of the Bible. So the Psalms and the Proverbs, which are great writings, but they're not the story of the people. So they take those out. Some of the theology stuff gets taken out. So it's more just the narrative stories, the history of what is in the Bible. And tonight is our last venture in the Old Testament. We'll be moving on to the New Testament next week. But tonight we're going to be in the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, I know Grant did a sermon on Esther last year, probably around this time, because I remember us being outside. And Esther is a shorter book. It is the last book in the Old Testament before you get to the Psalms and Job and Proverbs and all those types of things, right? Before you get to the wisdom books and then you have the prophets. So it is kind of like the last narrative. And it's also a very different book because it's the only book in the Bible that does not mention God. And so there are actually some people who were really against Esther being in the Bible to begin with. Because if it doesn't mention God, why would you put it in the Bible? But as we're going to explore a little bit here, it probably is even more powerful in some ways because it doesn't mention God. So the book of Esther takes place during the latter part of the Jewish exile. The Jews have been out of Israel and they've been dispersed a bit, mainly in Babylon. And the Babylonians ruled over them for a while. We talked about that, or you guys talked about that last week when I wasn't here, about Nebuchadnezzar and all those folks. Well, the Babylonians ended up getting taken over by the Persians. And so the Persians are who is leading kind of this area of the world now at this time. And their king is a man named Xerxes. And Xerxes is not the nicest guy. He's a little explosive, a little... there's some really good stories that aren't in the Bible about him that I advise you to Google if you're feeling like you're ready for some Halloweenish type stories or something. An interesting guy, to say the least. So, in the beginning of the book of Esther, Xerxes is having a party with his folks, and he's kicking it, right? And he's just loving it. And he's like, oh, I want to show off my queen to my friends here. So his queen wasn't quite like the queen in a lot of other areas of the world where the queen has some power. Queen didn't have much power. Queen was basically his favorite concubine because he had a big harem, and one of them became the queen, and that was basically because she was his favorite. So Queen Vashti was who was queen at the time, and she was throwing a party for her friends at the same time King Xerxes was throwing a party for his. And King Xerxes is like, all right, go send for Vashti, bring her here so I can show her off to my friends. I want my friends to see what my wife looks like. Oh, yeah. Well, she wasn't going to have it. She's like, I'm having a good time here with my friends. I don't want to come. And Xerxes was upset. He was so upset, he stripped her of being a queen and banished her from his presence forever, which, as a woman in that society, is not a good thing because she was going to be not living the lavish lifestyle she had become accustomed to and would not be favored. So he set out to find new women. And in this search, one of the women they found was a woman named Esther, who was Jewish, but she kept that hidden. There was a man in the king's court named Mordecai, and Mordecai also was a Jew. And Mordecai told Esther, and he was actually related to Esther, don't tell the king or anyone that you're Jewish. Just keep that secret. Because being Jewish was not a popular thing around there. Anti-Semitism is something we've experienced in the world many, many times. And that was certainly something that was happening at that time. So while she kept it quiet, she did become his favorite concubine, and he bequeathed her as queen. So she became the queen, and was very, very favored. Well, around this same time, Mordecai was getting into a little bit of squabble and trouble with a man named Haman. Haman was the number one person in King Xerxes' court. And Haman, he thought very high of himself. And so he wanted people to bow down and worship him and all this kind of stuff. And most people, when Haman would walk by, they would bow down. But Mordecai refused. And if you remember in Daniel, there's some stories where Daniel refused to do this, and Daniel ended up going into the lion's den. Well, Haman was so angry at Mordecai that he decided not only was he going to get Mordecai, but he knew Mordecai was Jewish, so he was going to destroy all the Jews. And so Mordecai is just devastated. And this is where we're going to pick up the story with the reading tonight. This is going to be from Esther chapter 4. Let me pull it up here. Okay. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And the king's edict was that on a certain date, the Jews would be slaughtered. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Haman's bitterness towards Mordecai and the Jewish people was so great that he was willing to spend his own money to guarantee they would be destroyed. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Now, the king did not know that Esther was Jewish. Also, as even the queen, she couldn't just go visit the king. He had to call for her. And if she went to see him when he hadn't called her, he had a choice. He could either hold out his scepter, which means come in, you're welcome, or he could just say, nope, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be here, and just kill her or banish her or whatever. A very brutal way of handling things. So Esther and Mordecai kind of go back and forth through this eunuch being the go-between here in conversation. Esther is in a position where she doesn't think she can do anything. If she tries to see the king, he may kill her. Mordecai reminds her that you are Jewish, and if you think you're going to escape this, because the king doesn't know you're Jewish, you're wrong. You have a chance to save your people here. If you don't, God will find, well, he doesn't say God, but he says another way will happen, which is even more alluding. There's so much in this story that doesn't say God, but it says about God, you know? There's no way these things can happen without God's presence in there. So Esther finally summons up enough courage to go to the king. Now, this is a very dangerous thing that she's doing, and she thinks she's not in a power position to be able to do this, but she ends up listening and doing it. As a result, the king is pleased to see her. He welcomes her in, and good things start to happen. She throws a party and invites the king and Haman. They have a great time. King's like, all right, whatever you want, up to half my kingdom, it's yours. She's like, well, let me throw another party for you two guys tomorrow, and then I'll tell you tomorrow what I want. And while this is happening, Haman is just like so tired of Mordecai. He's like, all right, I'm going to kill him tomorrow. So he builds this huge gallows, a big pole, and he wants to impale him on the pole in front of his own house so he can glorify the death of Mordecai. And what happens when he goes to tell the king in the morning, the queen's already telling why she's been sad to the king and that her people were going to be killed. And the king is livid. How could this happen? And she's like, well, there's the man. And Haman walks in and he has no idea what's going on, but knows it's not good. And then, boom, he's seized, he's impaled. And the king finds favor with Esther and Mordecai, and they get to write their own edict in which the Jewish people can protect themselves when these uprisings are supposed to happen. And as a result, instead of being annihilated, they end up killing the people that tried to kill them. And so the Jews are saved. Happiness, Purim, is what is comes out of this to celebrate this occasion, and it becomes a very important holiday for the Jewish folks. This is more than just a story of something that happened 2,500 years ago. This is actually something that can be very applicable to us today. Because sometimes you're going to be in a spot where you think you can't make a difference. You don't have any power. You don't have any authority. You don't have the ability to do something. Esther definitely thought she was in that situation. I'm sure Mordecai thought at times he was in that situation when he heard the edict and he was out in sackcloth. It wasn't until Esther's eunuch went out and talked to him where he finally felt, you know what? Esther can do something. We can be Esther. Sometimes we're put in that situation. There was a great example that they made a movie of back in the 90s called Schindler's List. And, you know, it's funny because this was the first one that came to me, and I'm just like, wow, another saving of the Jews story. And it just, to me, I think it really speaks to God's people. When you've seen what's happened to the Jewish people over years, and that God continues to protect them. You know, God's chosen people. That's a very important thing. So, in Schindler's List, a man named Oskar Schindler moves to Poland. He's a member of the SS, or at least the Nazi party, maybe not the SS, but he's a Nazi, from Czechoslovakia, I believe. And he decides to open up a warehouse, and he can get cheap labor from the Jews. So he's all excited. And he bribes the Nazis. It sounds kind of familiar, right? Like Haman bribing the king. So he can get his factory going and not have any problems with the Nazis. Everything's working great. He's making a ton of money. Then things start to change. The Jews live in kind of a ghetto area, and one night the Nazis decide it's time to build a concentration camp, and it's time to get these people out and move them to the concentration camp. So there's a night of murder and pillage and destroying of the ghetto, and those that weren't killed were sent to the concentration camps. And this totally changed Schindler. Schindler was just a businessman trying to make a lot of money. He was doing well. He did not think he was in a place to fight against the Nazis, to fight against Hitler. But when he saw what happened, things changed. And what did he do? He ended up saving thousands of Jews. There are so many people alive today because of what Oskar Schindler did. There's not as many people that may have been alive that he actually saved, but their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids most certainly are. And it's amazing to think that someone would take that risk and do so much. The story of Esther is one of risk. It's a calculated risk. What would have happened if Esther didn't take that risk? The Jews would have been killed. Maybe she would have survived. Maybe. But she was so afraid that she would have certain death by going to the king, but did it anyways. She took the calculated risk to do something. And as this story kind of suggests, is that God's in control. And, it kind of reminds me of Daniel again, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are ready to go into the furnace. And, they say, our God will save us. And even if he doesn't, we still won't bow down to you. Facing certain death, they did not give up. And Esther is kind of along the same lines. She's put in a certain place. She had no choice to be a queen. She had no choice to be a concubine. She was beautiful, so they took her. The king was delighted with her. But she made the most out of that. She made a difference that has been memorialized for ages. Where God's put you, maybe it won't be memorialized for ages. Maybe it will. But he's put you in places where you can make a difference, even where you think you can't. Be open to that. Pay attention. Look to see where God is working in your life and where he wants you to go, what he wants you to do. Because the least likely moment may be when it happens. All right, now